Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and joining me today is a returning guest. Although it's been since 2012 that you were on the podcast, it's Megan Staples from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Connecticut. Megan, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
We have interacted at conferences, and I've read your work and continue to read your work, but I can't believe it took me this long to invite you back on the podcast officially. So thanks for coming back.
It's like having a sabbatical. Like every 14 years, I'll come back. It's
Okay.
a double sabbatical.
All right. I'll put it on the calendar. But no, I'm excited though because Megan's team has been working around some democratically infused sort of ideas about math lessons, and I saw an article that came out, and actually we were talking about it at a conference, and I am excited to hear from you a little bit about this article. It's in Educational Designer, which if people aren't familiar, that's a journal that's freely available online. You can go to educationaldesigner.org and you can find this article and many other really interesting articles. But Megan's is called Designing for Mathematically Enriched Democratic Dialogues, the Mind Lesson Model. And I want to let you also give an acknowledgement to your co-authors on this paper as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I had two wonderful graduate students, Caitlin Cito and Toby Way, work with me on it. So grateful for them and all their contributions. And I should also just do a shout out to John Madura, was the fabulous classroom teacher that let us pilot these a fair amount in his lesson. So shout out to him and his classes.
Yeah, and that's something I really enjoyed with this article was that feeling of learning with you. You tried some things out, you made some adjustments, you found some things that work, and you're sharing those with the field. But you shared a little bit of your process and what went wrong, along with where you arrived and what you kind of figured out along the way. But the whole point is in designing these kind of complex lessons that get democratic dialogues happening, that get students to dig into some mathematics, but also some issues that relate to society, relate to the way we live together in a democracy, hopefully. So let me go back to the Math and Democracy Project. How did that project get started? How did you get involved in this democratic kind of work? And what were the overall goals of the project at large?
It's actually hard for me to remember exactly the impetus. I think I've been very interested in these ideas for a long time. The idea that if we take schooling as a public and social good and treat it as something that is necessary for sustaining a democracy, or one of the purposes that should be expected of schools is to support our democratic participation of everyone that goes through schooling, then it makes sense to me to really think about, so what's mathematics' contribution to that, right? So, and I've always been very interested in how mathematics shows up and how people reason about things. And so I was very lucky several years ago to get a Dean's Incentive Grant to sort of explore these ideas a little bit more. And so that's kind of the genesis of the MIND model itself, came out of that Dean's Incentive Grant.
Yeah, and you connect to some things that math ed folks listening might be familiar with, like Math for Social Justice, and you cite a lot of that literature. But you also connect to some things from outside of math ed. You brought in civic discourse, civic reasoning.
Mhm.
Maybe how did those other disciplines factor in, and how has that shaped your thinking just from a broad sense before we get into the details of the article?
Those, so there's a huge area in social studies education, right? They think a lot about this civic participation and so on. And even in science, right? They think about the citizen scientist. And so it really just made sense to look broadly and try to understand some of the work that was being done. So those two terms were, areas that we did look into. And I think the civic reasoning really resonated with us. So I believe it's Stitt's line that talks about it is what we do when we're deciding what to do. And the we is very important in there, right? What we do when we're deciding what to do. That describes the nature of the dialogue that we need to be having when we're having deliberations about what we should do. And in a democratic society, we should be thinking about, what do we do that is fair? What do we do that is in service of the collective good, at least on some level? So we prioritize those values. So that's how those things really got linked in. And we had a wonderful group. The Dodd Center for Human Rights is here at UConn, and they support these dialogues on Saturday mornings that are public dialogues. Anybody can show up. And so I was familiar with their work. And so I loved how they created space for that. And then our challenge was to figure out how to allow mathematics into that space to inform some of those conversations.
Hmm. And one more kind of top level thing, the mind lessons, which is mathematics and democracy. The mind lessons, what are the overall goals of those mind lessons before we get into some of the specific features and the specific design principles you have for them? But what are mind lessons just from a top level orientation?
The mind lesson, I would say it is a lesson model that creates a space for civic dialogue and reasoning that is mathematically informed. So it's a structured lesson that includes some structured conversation with deliberate introduction of mathematical ideas that are relevant to the social topic that is being discussed.
All right. And I think this might come to life as we talk through some of the design principles and things and hear your experiences developing these kinds of lessons. So the article lays out a set of design principles that help build, put together a mind lesson that will do those things that you're talking about. So maybe you can talk us through the design principles and we can probe each of them a little bit. So the first one talks about using the structure of collaborative conversations. And then there's specifically this approach called encounters. So maybe tell us a little bit about that design principle and how that came about.
Perfect. So yeah, the encounters was what the Dodd Center does when it does its work with the public. So those are like 3 hour conversations. The collaborative conversations was they had actually taken that for use in a social studies class. So more organizing it to support the dialogue. So I would say key features of that structured conversation is that it's set up that the conversation is not a debate. And that is super important. It's not about convincing anybody else about your idea. It's about engaging so that you learn more. You might become more refined in your idea or more expansive in your idea. So that's a key piece. A second key piece is that everybody has a voice. So there's deliberate rounds in that conversation where everybody is asked, what do you want to say? And you can pass, but the expectation is that you'll offer just so everybody's voice is in the room. And then a third piece of that we do to different degrees. It is very much about the group coming together, but there's a space at the very end for an expert. And so it's the idea that in a democratic conversation, like we don't know everything and we can turn to experts. And so that's the last piece where you can develop questions that you would ask an expert that would then better inform your point of view or answer some questions that were there for you.
But it seems important to me that the expert is at the end and not front loaded at the beginning,
Yes.
right? Like the expert doesn't come in as I have all the answers already, just shut up and listen. There's a conversation first, there's questions that come out, points of view that come out, and then the expert can inform the conversation that's already kind of taken the stage.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are centering the group in the room and then it's informed as you have questions that you would like answered by them. They're not lecturing to you, you're asking them questions.
Nice. Another design principle, and we can circle back at it because I know some of these interconnect and things, but
Sure.
to lay another design principle out there, there's a principle: create key questions that support a consideration of others' viewpoints. So I see questions in there, but I see again the other people's viewpoints, and so maybe tell us a little bit about that principle.
Yeah, that one is a challenge for us. It's a great principle, but writing those questions is tricky. So this is the idea that one, you don't want to set up a debate, right? So you're setting up a different kind of conversation. But two, you're trying to put people in a slightly different perspective so that they're not necessarily going right from the individual perspective. So I'll have to give an example, and that might help. One of the lessons is around sort of vaccines, right? And we didn't want the question, should you or should you not get vaccinated, right? You could give students lots of data and so on and look at trends and ask that question. But for democracy, the better question we decided, and the one that allows for more conversation, is a question of under what conditions should a state mandate a vaccine? And so with that, we make very clear to the students, you always have a choice, right? This is how our democracy works. There's a lot of individual freedoms and rights. So we're not talking about whether the individual would choose to or not. What we're talking about is whether a state Department of Public, Health would decide that that is a good recommendation, based on all kinds of other factors like mortality, contagiousness, efficacy of vaccine, and so on. So those questions were really important for positioning people in the right mindset about the focus of the conversation and also moving people away from feeling sort of personally threatened. No, we didn't want it too close to individual beliefs.
Yeah, that seems super important, like the framing at the beginning. This is not about pitting individuals against each other, and it's not about judging one person's choice or whatever. It's really talking about the collective, going back to what you said about democracy.
Mhm.
It's like, hey, we have to live together, so we have to have some sort of way of making collective decisions. And so framing it that way seems really kind of crucial. And then it also seems like it could be mathematical, and I know this gets to some of the later parts. But when you phrased it about like what thresholds or under what criteria, now you can actually talk about, well, how do you measure that criteria and how do you weigh that criteria against another one?
Mhm.
And so now you maybe have some opportunities for mathematics in a way that wouldn't come in if you just said, should I get it or should you get it? Like,
Right.
there's not as much mathematics there. It's more about just a person's choice.
Absolutely. And then, a nice thing that you've brought up there is when we make decisions as sort of, deliberations, democratic decision making, values always come into play. So you are weighing things, right? It's not like a deductive argument or it's not solely belief based. We have to put together, mathematically informed, I would like to commit to
Hmm.
a mathematically informed reasoning, but your values and your priorities are going to come into play, and they always do in a democracy.
Yeah, we can't have our mathematical goal of proving to the other one what the result is or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next design principle is about selecting lesson content with contextual information. And we'll talk about that one first, but then just to give a preview, because the other one kind of goes with it. The next one is about selecting lesson content with quantitative information.
Mm.
So you have a design principle about making sure there's a contextual information that can kind of surround and penetrate this lesson content, but also later you'll have the quantitative piece in there as well. So maybe you can take each of those in turn.
Absolutely. So the contextual information, if we're obviously have to give background and kind of put people on the same page, the contextual information can also, similar to what the question does, put people in kind of the right mindset. So, for example, and this is always funny to me, our vaccines lesson we actually created before the pandemic, and so when we ended up, we did that based on sort of there was a measles outbreak sort of in Texas, and so the contextual information was little bits about resources used when there is an outbreak, and there was a lot of contextual information about a variety of diseases, like not just measles, some that students would know, some that they wouldn't, some that would no longer be a threat, like chickenpox, and so on. But then, and we actually kept that information there, even though the first time we piloted it was during the pandemic. And I remember the teacher saying literally, like, that child just came back, they were quarantined, right? So again, moving it into the measles context was very helpful because obviously personal feelings could get in there. So we try to do short little clips that are engaging, whether it's a little, blurb. Another one that we talk a lot about had to do with intergenerational wealth. So contextualizing that in the particular case of Bruce's Beach, which maybe some people have heard about. It was the eminent domain was used to take land from a Black couple who had a very prosperous business in Manhattan Beach. So locating it there, which would allow us to set up the task, which would allow us to then explore the mathematics, because it's way too large to ask students to think about vaccines generally. It's way too large to ask people to think about intergenerational wealth abstractly, because the goal is to see how the mathematics informs what we think. It's not that the smaller context and the smaller task then informs our thinking about the bigger issue at play. So yeah, those things do go quite well together, and I've sort of flipped a little bit between them. But the contextual information is setting up the ability to engage the particular task that lets us talk about the larger issue.
So there is a larger issue, but then you give some specific examples, stories, cases of it that you can kind of grab onto. There was also one I know that was about roadway tolls, so I could
Yes.
imagine
Yeah.
that could get very specific. Like you could talk about a road that has tolls or a bridge or whatever, but there's also the broader, things that would be beyond that. And another one that was in the article I noticed was the educational funding, like
Yeah.
the state formula for how they give schools their money, public schools.
Yeah, and that's a great example of where we learn to contextualize, right? So if you have to think about every single district in your state, which Connecticut has 169, which I know people in the Midwest laugh about, like there's no reason for our tiny state to have so many districts, but we do. So with that one, people were familiar kind of generally with some of the ideas, but the contextual information was, well, what do you think goes into funding your school? Right. And that, building sort of a little bit of background on that, how our school's funded. And then we had to bring it down to, we just gave students 4 districts information. And we cut down from the massive budget of the whole state just to what we knew those 4 districts would have been funded. And we blinded the districts because we also didn't want that information and sort of the beliefs that go along with those things to be in play. So bringing things down to a space where students can then fiddle with math and see how the math plays out and how things are impacted was really important for sort of understanding the bigger issues at play. How do we fund schools equitably?
Yeah, and then let me return to the selecting a lesson content that has quantitative information. So maybe you could say a little bit more about bringing the quantitative part in. How do you get the mathematics? Are you looking for certain kinds of mathematics? How do you get that in there?
Yeah, we didn't start with certain kind of mathematics just because because there's so much mathematics, it would be very hard. I suppose you could try to build this as, okay, let's find Algebra 1 content. I think we wanted to more lead with our goal is to create lessons that help people understand how valuable mathematics is for civic discourse and for us making decisions collectively. So we wanted to start with an engaging context or an engaging issue that would reveal that. So we sort of led with that. Over time, I'm sure you could build it out and cut across multiple different content areas and so on. So we led more with those topics. I will say you mentioned the tolls one. We ended up finding that one wasn't that engaging for, high school kids, right? So it turned out they were just beginning to drive, like they didn't really think about tolls. They didn't care that much. I mean, the general public cared a lot, but they didn't really care that much. So we were looking for things that high school students would engage and had potentially some background knowledge of, or were very informative. Like they should understand where their educational funding comes from, and they didn't necessarily know that. So that's some bonus learning that happens there.
So it seems like the context kind of inspires some of the mathematics that makes sense. Like I can see some functional kind of reasoning, like putting together a formula with different inputs, and it's kind of all contributing to the outputs.
Mm.
Definitely with the vaccines, there would be some sort of ideas of growth and modeling growth and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Is that a pretty fair characterization that you kind of take the inspiration from the context and then you find the rich mathematics that just naturally sort of comes to the surface?
Yeah. Yep. I say that's fair. So, right. If we want, our Bruce's Beach lesson, our first iteration tried to do reparations, which was way too big and politically charged,
Mm.
but you're going to have to deal with exponential functions in there, right?
Mhm.
So, and that going in. If we want to think at all about intergenerational wealth, only if you can really think about that powerful growth over time, which is a core mathematical idea, will people be able to debate it from a space of deeper understanding, right? And so we knew that that would come into play. And so then the task was going to have to help reveal that kind of thing. With the vaccines, it was going to have to be understanding, efficacy rates and understanding mortality rates. So lots of, percentages and then tons of modeling because there's all this chance that happens there, right? And threshold effects. So at the outset, you kind of know a little bit of the mathematics, but then exactly how that plays out and how you help people see the impact of adjusting some of those quantities, that's where the task really comes into play.
Yeah, that to me is a powerful part of it. I wrote a little bit for NCTM in one of their modern math tasks books about the spread of COVID-19.
Hmm.
But just being able to use the mathematics to compare a little bit of a difference here and then what happens. And, sometimes a little bit of a change can actually make a big difference over a few months or so.
Hmm.
So that's another thing too, where it's like looking at the mathematical repercussions of changing the initial conditions or something like that. And be
Absolutely.
like, oh wow, just this little tweak here changes that whole thing. You can think about continuity, you can think about discontinuity, and yeah. Hey, this is Sam inserting myself from the future. I just want to clarify this point I was making about modeling the spread of COVID-19 because as I listened back to it, I realized I was kind of vague, and this point pertains to one of my favorite graphs I've ever made for a publication, so I want to do it justice here. As I mentioned, the modeling situation comes from the NCTM book on modern math tasks to provoke transformational thinking, and I want to add that that's edited by Suzanne Harper and Dana Cox. What I was looking at in my chapter, together with my co-authors Julia Bemke and Jared Webb, was the exponential spread of COVID-19 over the first few months of the pandemic. You can probably imagine the pretty drastic upward exponential curve. Using the real dataset of cases, students can find an exponential function that roughly matches that upward curve. Then the important stuff happens in the task, which is that students can consider alterations to the mathematical model. For example, what would happen if people wore masks, even if the masks are just 10% effective? Some people who don't really have a good grasp of exponential functions might think that 10% effectiveness is pretty weak, almost insignificant given the widespread nature of the virus. But the mathematical modeling tasks reveal how important even a 10% intervention can be. In the book chapter, you can see the actual graph that compares two different understandings of the situation. One misunderstanding is that a 10% effective intervention will simply lower the number of cases by 10%. This curve that results is very, very similar to the original drastic upward curve. The function height is basically just a little bit lower, 10% lower in terms of height each day, but you're following the same curve. It's basically the same national crisis and the same surge on hospitals and everything. But then there's the other curve, the second curve, which shows what happens if the spread itself is reduced by 10%. And this is what masks can do. They can reduce the spread, not just the number of cases. If they're worn properly, masks can be much more effective than 10%. But given realistic conditions and knowing human nature and people, it's plausible that in the population it might only be 10% effective. But still, when we graph that using the mathematical model, reducing the spread factor by 10%, it makes a huge difference. The resultant curve is very low and gradual. It's still going up and it's still exponential, but it would have given several months more prep time for hospitals and more research time for scientists before there was any sort of big surge. The graph tells the story better than I can here of that massive difference between a 10% reduction in function values versus a 10% reduction in the spread factor of the exponential function itself. And maybe if more of the population had this sort of functional understanding, a real grasp on this mathematics, maybe people wouldn't have written off masks so easily. I know, of course, math ed considerations are very, very far down on the list of political and social forces at play, but as math educators, we can still dream, can't we? All right, back to the conversation with Megan Staples. You mentioned, though, the task that you come up with and having it reveal the mathematics and still following the context. And that is, I think, leads to the fifth design principle, which is to develop an activity that allows for sense making, including the quantitative sense making of key ideas. Now, that probably,
Hmm.
that almost has it could be a whole article itself, right? Just number five of how to develop that activity that kind of brings it all together and lets it flourish. But what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, certainly we can state it that way, and there would not only would be another article, it would probably be would really have to do a lot more work to really figure out, okay, what exactly are all those pieces, right? And there's probably lots of ways to do it. That one, part of where that principle came from is we realized just presenting mathematical information did not mean that people engaged it. And that maybe that sounds silly in retrospect, but for example, with the educational cost sharing formula, like when we just presented data, people didn't really use it when they were sort of making their statements. And I only had like one person who was a math teacher. They started really fiddling with it and kind of coming up with percentages and things like that and starting comparing. But generally, folks didn't really seem to say, oh, I have math in front of me. Let me see what this means if I kind of compare different numbers. So it's kind of interesting because we initially, that's where we most departed from that. Collaborative conversations encounters model because they don't set a task, right? It's really set as a dialogue. Everyone's sort of equal in this. And so we were a little bit hesitant to do that, but we realized that the mathematics, either folks didn't necessarily know what to do with it or didn't realize it could give insights. And, to be fair, we are actually designing these because we think that there should be some insights that come out of it. So that's where we had to start thinking about, okay, well, what task can we ask people to do that is a very accessible task that can reveal how mathematics matters in this particular context? I don't know if we have a formula for doing that yet, but I will say that it needs to be one that the students really can drive and play with. So, for example, in the educational cost sharing one, we give them cards with the data for a town, and then they can kind of, even just that physically moving them into things they think are important or not. In the Bruce's Beach, we give them the choice of, okay, do you want to model out the amount of you think the economic impact on them by losing the business, right? And then, okay, do you want to model out the economic impact on them by losing the land? They actually, but when you put both there and don't give enough of a foothold,
Mm.
it was too swirly, is kind of the word I'd use. And so giving a little bit of a focus. And, there's a good chunk of time that we allocate to that and just really let them play with the ideas. There's no right or wrong. What insights are you developing? And then we reflect as a whole group and share out.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you to kind of step back too, because you've been working on this for a while with your team. You've been debriefing, you've been trying things out, making adjustments. And again, for the mind lessons overall, and I probably should have said earlier, the MIND is an acronym for the mathematics in democracy. It's much clearer when I see it in writing, and I realize saying it out loud might not as be as clear.
Doesn't reveal
But
that.
when you
Yeah.
think about the mind lessons that you've done and this whole process, what has been most exciting for you in this work? But also, what has been the most challenging part of this work on the mind lessons?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the most exciting is when students are sitting there and saying, "Oh, wow," right? Like I didn't see that before, or they're making like a real, like a personal connection to it. So that's really exciting. So Yeah, just the aha moments. Like, wow, I had no idea that, they would be I wouldn't be billionaires, but like I had no idea, right? Like sort of that insight. Or even as a student, we had one student was like, wow, yeah, that happened to me too. And their land had actually been used for eminent domain. So just any kind of connection like that and understanding how math can help them think about some of those pieces. So that has been really cool. And I'd say also a really exciting thing is the times we have had experts in the room, like we got to pilot the ECS Formula One, and the teacher, John Mardore I mentioned, asked his state rep to be there via Zoom. And so the kids at the end of the session were able to talk to, the state rep, ask the questions. And that's just such an expansive, educative experience for everybody involved. And so that was a wonderful piece of it.
Hopefully it leaves them with a bit of a sense that like this stuff is not entirely mysterious. Like there's actually mathematics and data underneath it and you can actually kind of understand it or grasp it. And also there are human beings. Like
Yeah.
there are actual human beings that are in this job to make some of these decisions and implement the formula. And so demystifying it in a way to realize like, oh,
Mhm.
there's real data, real people behind this. It's not just something up in the clouds.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want, our goal is not to, a goal out of social studies education would be like, oh, we want to make sure they vote. We want to make sure that they, do X, Y, or Z. That's not our goal, but I do think that can come out of it, right? When you realize people are behind these things, and you have as much of a voice as any other person in the room. So I think that's a wonderful thing. Anytime you can get students to be educated broadly through their experiences in school. So yeah, that was exciting. The biggest challenges, I mean, just developing the lessons. Like it's taking these big ideas and then figuring out where's the foothold going to be, and how do we not be too prescriptive with the mathematics? How do we leave enough space there, but still allow for insights? And then I'd say another challenge is honestly getting good data, right? That's going to be reliable, and just looking for those sources like, okay, these differ a little bit. Do we understand how they differ? Okay, this say is saying something slightly different. Okay, did it change last year? Anytime you're dealing with anything in a very real context. I mean, the Bruce's Beach one is a fun example. It doesn't speak directly to that challenge, but by the time, within a year of doing the lesson, things had changed. They'd actually returned it to the Bruce family, which is wonderful and actually enriches the lesson by being able to show a video clip on that. It doesn't invalidate the lesson, but things just change quickly. So anytime data is involved, updating them is definitely a challenge.
Mhm. But no huge amounts of pushback from taking this approach in math or because a lot of people might fear if I bring up any of these sensitive topics, even if you do it very thoughtfully with a plan and with these principles,
Mhm.
there still might be some backlash or something, anything on that.
Nothing on that per se, but we've just collaborated with teachers that are willing to do that.
Mm,
And I so admire and value teachers that they don't necessarily see those things as constraints, right? They feel like this is the way to engage my students and educate my students, and it's wonderful mathematics. So no pushback, I think mostly because of the folks that we've partnered with.
mhm.
But I can readily see that happening. And I think that's a real challenge, especially in our current, politicized world. So, but that speaks more to exactly why we need this kind of conversation. Because I don't think that you can't just suddenly learn to discuss issues and, have democratic dialogues unless you've actually had experiences doing that.
Yeah. Well, looking forward, what would be the next steps for this project and where could people go if they wanted to find out more information from this work?
Next steps, I think, is to still keep building a few more lessons. So just keep playing them out, seeing where some of those can take us. I think longer term, one of my dreams would be to create a framework that outlines, what are the mathematical demands of democratic participation. So I'm very curious if we could sort of name that and highlight some of that mathematics. And I think some of that mathematics is not going to be named or highlighted in our current standards. And things I think about are like if we want to think about risk, like risk is such an important idea mathematically, but we don't teach that in that language or in those contexts. So I could imagine, and then the hope would be, okay, if we understand a little bit more about the mathematical demands of democratic participation, are we supporting people in developing those competencies so that they can have mathematically informed dialogues?
And is there anything besides the article that people could find that's available?
Thank you. I knew there was a part two to that question that I hadn't. So yes, we have a website that is just I think it's Math in Democracy, probably .uconn.edu. And there are lessons posted there and some supporting materials. And more than happy to talk about these ideas at any point in time.
Yeah, great. Also, just Megan, while you're here, is there anything else on your mind? Is there anything else that you're working on that's kind of a brewing in your scholarship?
Oh, I interesting project that I did with Kyle Evans and Sean Chorney, who's up at Simon Fraser, just about socio-mathematical reasoning, which I think is very related to some of this. So I don't know. I don't know if I'd call it sort of really brewing, but I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas there to keep working on. Thinking about how mathematics is the way it functions in society is not as a purely deductive system. And so, really understanding what are those mathematical practices that bring together values, beliefs, reasoning that's not purely mathematical and yet still very mathematical in a different kind of way.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of rich and deep ideas that you're grappling with. You don't take the easy road, it sounds like. You dig into some of the hard stuff. But Megan, thanks so much for coming back. And yeah, as I mentioned before, you were on the second episode ever of this podcast back in 2012.
Love that. Yes.
I did have my trusty question where I asked people about their alternative careers. I already had that from the beginning, thanks to Aaron Brackenicki. But I wanted to just revisit yours. So back in 2012, I don't know if you remember, but I asked you about an alternative career, and you said you'd be a genealogist, digging into family histories and things like that. Would that still be something that you're interested in or doing if you had the chance?
It definitely would still be. Yep, absolutely.
Have you had any chance to use some of the new tools that didn't even exist in 2012 to do some of that?
Yeah, that's actually a fun thing is practically I don't have enough time to do that, but when I do and dip back into some of those databases, like more and more stuff is coming online. So it's quite incredible. So yes, it's a few years back now, but I was able to put together a little book for my family just on my mom's side and really just explore back through and try and lay out some kind of narrative. I did have more dates and numbers in there than maybe some of my relatives would have liked, but I had to put in the quantitative
Got
context.
to be thorough. That's part of the deal.
Yes, got to be thorough. So I had a few footnotes. But yeah, I really did much more narrative and threw in the pictures we could find. So it's neat. It's really neat to be able to find more and more and contextualize how you got to where you got to, putting those puzzle pieces together.
Yeah, it's definitely good for every family to have at least somebody that takes it on as a hobby or something, because then the other family can just benefit from your hard work and doing the legwork to get it all down.
100%. Yes.
Well, Megan, it's been great talking to you. Thanks again for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Sam. Pleasure as always.